Okay, so this class, Religion, Liberalism, and the law with focus in the case of Islam, right? So this is a class I teach regularly at the law school as part of as a seminar. It's the one class I teach that's kind of in my research bailiwick. So I spend a lot of time on these materials, and the theoretical parts of the course often structure the research questions I ask about Islamic law, at least on one aspect of my writing. So I'll try to make this material accessible to you. I hope it'll be educational and beneficial to you all. So the first thing we're doing for the first set of readings, it was trying to sort of lay out the fundamental principles of liberal approaches to religion, right? And so we did that through a series of 3 readings. The first is Rawls's essay, The Idea of Public Reason Revisited. The second is John Oddie's, Habermas's essay, Religion in the Public Sphere, and the third is Robert Audie's essay. I can't remember the title of it right now. Separation. Yeah. So those three articles are supposed to give you an idea of the normative theory of religion in liberal thinking, right? Now, the 3 thinkers that I gave you, in some sense, are, I would say, sort of orthodox liberals in this regard. Rawls and Habermas are kind of giants in the sort of North American tradition of liberalism and the continental tradition of liberalism, respectively. And so they're good spots to get introduced to how prominent liberal thinkers think not only about religion, but also about liberalism, okay? Because there are different versions of liberalism. If you haven't studied political philosophy and you're relying on maybe a high school civics version of liberalism, the liberalism that's presented or assumed by Rawls and Habermas might be very different from your own intuitions about what liberalism is, okay? So I'm going to start off by talking about, different ideas of liberalism, okay? So we can talk about liberalism, or let me make this interactive since we're a seminar. What are the sort of ideas that liberalism generates in your minds? Firas. It doesn't have, because it's not based on reading, it's just based on sort of your common sense.
I guess like free thinking.
Okay, freedom of thought. Okay, what else? Rahan, what do you associate with liberalism?
I think the state staying out of my personal business.
Okay, right to privacy, let's say, call that right to privacy. Munir?
Personal agency. I don't know, that's different from freedom of thought, perhaps. Just like ability to make choices of one's own.
Like self-determination. Self-determination. Mike? Kenny. Sorry, I don't know why I said Mike. Kenny, go ahead.
Individualism.
Okay. Harvey? Evan, sorry.
Maybe this would go with the last 2 as well, but in kind of an acceptance of pluralism.
Okay. That seems to be implicit in these ideas,
Yeah.
right? If everybody has individual rights and freedom of thought, right to privacy, self-determination, then you're going to, as a consequence, you're going to have pluralism, unless everybody's exactly the same, which, we add that premise, everyone is different, right? So we're going to have pluralism. Okay. How about rule of law? Right? That you can't, you can't be prevented from doing something except pursuant to a law, right? So, you know, your ability to pursue your own ends, you're free to pursue your own ends, except where sort of the law tells you. So, you know, you can't drive 100 miles an hour to get here on time, for example, let's say. Officer, but the class is so important, right? Yeah, you can't do that. Okay, so rule of law. But also, right, the rule of law not only applies to us as individuals, who else does it apply to? Very importantly,
The government.
the government, right? So we have an ideal of limited government, right? That the government must act by law and is bound to respect law. Okay. What's one thing that seems to be very absent from these things that you guys threw up here?
Any sort of theistic element.
Okay, well, God, no God, but okay, we'll say that. But what else seems to be really, really, when I say it, you're going to be shocked?
Democracy, maybe?
Okay. Democracy seems to be missing. What else?
The idea of change in society. So like, I'm thinking from the opposite end, conservatism, conserve more of the past, and embrace less change. So I guess liberalism implies a higher degree of change, progress,
Okay.
progressiveness.
I'm not necessarily convinced, but I'll put that here. What else? What else seems to be missing from this little laundry list of a free association that we associate with liberalism?
Right to property.
Okay. I mean, I'll put that here.
My natural right, I'm born free, and now everyone else.
Well, I think that's kind of
constraints on me.
implicit in all of this stuff like self-determination. We're gonna play not Jeopardy. What's the game show that comes before Jeopardy? Wheel of Fortune. So people start throwing out consonants for me. So I will put it's so I'm gonna confuse your name again.
Kenny.
Kenny. Give me a consonant.
C.
No C.
D.
No.
Like the
Evan.
Bible.
S.
No. For us.
L.
Okay, we have an L. Wait a second, hold on. I think I put one too many things. Oh no, that's right. We have an L. Right hand.
R.
I'm not going to call you Fuad because you've done this class before. Munir.
G.
No. I mean, what would G be? What? Kenny.
P.
No.
No P.
You guys are so random, so you have like no. Evan.
M.
What word are you thinking with M?
I don't have a word.
You don't have a word at all? Okay, for us?
S.
No. No, we're just.
N.
B.
And I had.
We're running out of consonants.
Yeah.
Do you want to buy a vowel?
I'll take an E, please.
You have to buy a vowel, right? You don't. You.
I don't know how much I got on me.
So okay, come on.
R.
No.
F.
No. I mean, it's like you would think randomly you would get a letter, but
said R.
Yeah.
S. T.
Okay.
U.
Something,
Yeah.
and there's a Y at the end.
I.
Equality.
Yes. Equality. Now it's interesting that none of you, that the idea of equality didn't sort of come up as a basic idea when I was asking about your associations with liberalism. What did show up was your sense of personal right. Okay, so we can talk about this as in this idea of. I'm just going to erase this. Of negative freedom. So negative freedom is just the idea that nobody should interfere with your life, right? And so liberalism gives priority to this ideal of negative freedom. Every person should be able to do what he or she wishes, right? That's kind of the fundamental idea of liberalism, right? And justifications on somebody's freedom, you would have to have a justification to stop somebody from doing what he or she wishes. Okay? Now, that's not the only kind of freedom, the idea of freedom that exists. There's something called positive freedom. Does anybody know what positive freedom is? Has everybody come across this idea of positive freedom? Evan?
Yes, I think it's something like the ability to achieve goals, or at your own ends.
Yeah, it's the ability to achieve your own ends, right? Somebody is positively free when he or she has the capacity to pursue the ends that she sets for herself, right? So if one has the goal to, let's say, complete a university education, but lacks the funds to do so, she is not free in a positive sense, even though nobody's stopping her from doing so, right? Okay, if you are, let's say, a gambling addict, you wish to stop gambling because you want to use your resources, right, to keep your home, for example, as opposed to like being thrown out of your home, right? But you can't stop gambling. You are free in a negative sense, insofar as nobody is stopping you from continuing to continue your gambling habit, but you're not free in the positive sense because you're not able to achieve your goal, namely of keeping your house. Okay, so this is a different way. This is a different conception of freedom. And as it turns out, of course, I think there are plenty of places where we care about positive freedom in liberal societies as well. But as a kind of emphasis, the thumb on the scale is negative freedom, right, in a liberal society. That what's considered truly crucial is negative freedom, freedom understood as non-interference. Now, once we realize that this kind of ideal of non-interference is sort of the default assumption culturally that we associate with liberalism, it becomes easy to understand why none of us sort of brought up equality when we're doing sort of this game of free association. Even though I think we would all say that one of the fundamental premises of liberalism, at least as we understand it, is that all human beings are equal. Okay? But if the only thing you care about is negative freedom, that doesn't necessarily cash out into any kind of duty to ensure everyone has an equal degree of positive freedom, right? So you could be indifferent to the fact that most people are unable to pursue an education. Because you say, well, I'm not interfering in their freedom. It's just bad luck that they don't have money to go to school, right? But I'm not doing anything, I'm not acting unjustly toward them. I'm not precluding them from education by my actions, right? It's just that, you know, they don't have the means to do so, okay? So this is a certain kind of liberalism. It just emphasizes negative freedom, but has no deep concern for equality outside of, let's say, just say formal equality. We posit everybody has the same kind of rights, and that's all that's required. What's the core is negative freedom, and that is what is being protected, so we're good. The thinkers that we looked at don't necessarily agree with that, right? They don't limit their liberalism to negative freedom. Okay, they have a sort of, let's say, a deeper concern about equality, right? And so this goes to the idea of justice. There has to be some sort of just distribution of goods and entitlements in society in addition to mere negative freedom. Okay? And in connection with things like the rule of law, right? Equality has to be taken seriously in the way laws are made, right? And what that means is that law has to be something that's consistent with our individual freedom. So we start with this idea that, you know, we're all free. We should all be free to do what we want in the absence of some sort of law preventing us from acting. Okay? We're all equal in terms of having the same right of non-interference. And so now we're only going to look to the law to interfere as a legitimate source of interference in freedom. But now the question is, what makes a law legitimate? Right? What makes a law legitimate? And so here, the liberals that we were looking at today, right, they have the claim that a law is only legitimate if it's a law that you would give for yourself. If the law is one that you would give to yourself, then you are binding yourself, right? And so it's not a true interference in your freedom. It's not a true interference in your freedom because you've chosen to come here, for example. You've chosen to follow the speed limit because the law, the speed limit, is the law that you've given yourself, right? So it's not really restricting your freedom. It's a manifestation of your freedom. Okay? Well, how can that possibly be true? How can it be that the law, on the one hand, restrains you, but at the same time is consistent with your freedom? Well, that would be the case if you, in fact, are the legislator. Right? That's kind of the idea. Right? And so this gives rise to the idea of democracy. Right? Democracy is the form of government that is most consistent with liberalism because not only because it produces law that is plausibly described as law authored by the people who are subject to it. So therefore, we would think it would give us the optimal mix of negative freedom and positive freedom. Okay. So, what does it mean for a law to be truly democratic? Right? This is kind of the debate that these public reason liberals are sort of teeing up for us. For all of these thinkers, Rawls, Habermas, Audi, a law can only truly be democratic if it's based on reasons that all of us, as equal individuals, could reasonably be expected to endorse. Okay? Otherwise, it's just an act of arbitrary power. So a majority is no different than a king in that regard, or a dictator. If a king or a dictator or a majority can just issue commands to the public or the minority without having to justify that law, then what we're talking about is just despotism. Okay, the despot doesn't have to justify his laws. Okay, so what makes the majority rule principle legitimate? According to Rawls and Habermas and Audi, etc., the majority principle is not legitimate because it represents, on balance, a greater amount of social power than those who are in the minority, or that the majority is somehow epistemologically privileged to know what's best for the minority, sort of in a paternalistic kind of way, right? What makes democratic procedures legitimate is the assumption that the reasons that are being adopted for the law are of the sort that everyone accepts are legitimate basis for restricting freedoms. Okay? And so you'll say, well, but Fadel, Professor Fadel, the minority disagreed with them, right? Okay? But the reply is, the best we can do in a situation of disagreement is to make a judgment, right? And as long as the premises that we're all that we're using to make our decision are held in common, such that we can agree that these are legitimate basis for making a decision, then to that extent, at least, we can say that the decision is common to all of us, right? But if the decision is based on some reason that we know a third or 40% or 25% or 10% or 5%, whatever, doesn't matter, is based on a reason that they will, with good reason, reject, right? Then it's illegitimate, because now you just have domination, right, by a majority or a king or a pope or whatever of that group. Okay? So the whole issue of these three articles is what kind of reasons should count in public deliberation, right? So their whole idea of democracy is that democracy requires lawmaking, restrictions of freedom, based on reasons that everybody should be able to accept. Okay? And religion is one of those reasons that is paradigmatic of reasons that people can reasonably refuse to accept. Okay? So the fact that the Catholic Church teaches that abortion is a mortal sin is not considered, right, to be conclusive evidence requiring everybody to accede to that opinion. Okay? So that would be an example of a reason, according to them, that would be illegitimate for a law prohibiting abortion. Even if 90% of the people are believing in devout religious Roman Catholics, right? Because in that case, they're relying on a reason that they know the 10% has no reason to find persuasive, right? Okay, so mere counting of votes, right, is not sufficient, according to these theories, to make a law democratic. Because you start off with this ideal of personal freedom. Personal freedom can only be restricted by a law that one would give to oneself, that makes it autonomous. Self-autonomy, what does autonomous mean? I think somebody said autonomous in in our free association period. Autonomous means giving law to oneself, right? Nomos is law, auto, self, right? And so public law is only consistent with our individual autonomy if it's of the kind that we recognize as coming from ourselves. And ideally, that would mean every one of us agree to it subjectively, but that's impossible. So instead, we say that the reasons that we give are of the sort that everybody should accept, right? So that's why religion becomes problematic, at least according to these theorists, right? Now, that's not the only model. We can call that the deliberative democracy model, that it takes equally seriously the ideas of negative freedom and equality to produce a model of lawmaking based on preservation of autonomy, right? So laws are only legitimate to the extent that they reflect some kind of deliberative agreement. And that requires that the reasons be given, that the reasons given for the coercion are politically legitimate in one way or another. Okay? In other words, they are of the sort of reasons that everybody should be able to find persuasive, even if in a particular case they're not persuaded by it. But in general, they accept it as legitimate, right? So again, if we were to talk about Islam, in general, we can agree that hadith or sunnah is a proof, even if we disagree on a particular hadith being persuasive in a particular case, right? But we agree as a class that the statements, actions, and tacit approvals of the Prophet are of a genus of reasons for action, right? Okay. Okay, so I wanted to introduce to you this idea of deliberative democracy on the one hand, which Rawls and Habermas and Audi are vindicating, or that's sort of the tradition they're coming from a different conception of democracy, which is perhaps more familiar to us in the United States. You could say pluralist democracy, competitive democracy, agonistic democracy, right? In which the assumption is the pluralism that results from freedom. I think Evan mentioned pluralism, right? The pluralism that results from individual freedom is so deep, and the conflict is so deep, that you can't expect any kind of meaningful agreement on anything. So this idea of deliberative democracy is pie in the sky nonsense, right? And law is just kind of a set of formal restrictions, formal rules of the game, right? That doesn't represent any kind of deeper agreement on principle. It's just rules of the game for the distribution of power, and that as long as you are acting within those rules, right, you can sort of do what you want. Okay? So a law is a law because a majority of both houses of the House of Representatives and the Senate approve it, and the president signs it. It doesn't represent, and there's no requirement that there be some sort of common reason that justifies this kind of law, provided, of course, that the law is constitutional, right? Okay, so you can call this a kind of pluralist democracy, right, which is sort of not necessarily concerned, or proceduralist democracy, which isn't necessarily concerned about having a common basis for public decision making. Okay, and that kind of gets at the root of a lot of the structure of what Rawls is doing. Okay, so and some of the same concerns are raised by Habermas and Audi, right? So here I want to shift gears now and begin to talk a little bit about Rawls' specific ideas. So Rawls introduces this idea of a modus vivendi, which he contrast. What is the contrast modus vivendi to? Does anybody remember? He calls it an overlapping consensus. Now this is a really important binary.